I'm delighted to introduce our poet for the evening. Ron was born in British Columbia, but has lived most of his life in Oregon. He's the author of 5 books of poetry: The Anxious Ground, The Quietness That Is Our Name, which was part of the Pacific House series, The Broken World, Night Sky from Stone City Press, and most recently, A Secret Weeping of Stones, New and Selected Poems. He is also the editor of Stone City One, an anthology of Oregon poetry from Stone City Press. In 1985, his poem, Portlandia, was selected as the official dedication poem for the statue, Portlandia. The second largest beaten, let's give them a hand. Which is the second largest beaten copper statue in the United States, second only to the Statue of Liberty. Yes, that's right. It is permanently displayed on the statue's dedication plaque. In 2009, Anxious Ground was selected by the Oregon State Library as one of the 150 best books of poetry published by an Oregonian since the establishment of statehood. In addition to poetry, he's also authored a novel, Knockers Up, from Inkwater Press, The Archives of Silence, a Father's Memoir, and a juvenile mystery novel, The Ghost of Dead Man's Hollow. His individual poems, articles, and essays have appeared widely in numerous journals, quarterlies, etc., including the Prescott Street Reader and Poets West. Ron, I know Ron travels, so I've just been communicating with him when he was in Hawaii. He lives in Lake Oswego. He graduated from Portland State with a BA in General Studies and Humanities, did graduate work at the University of Southern California, and received his JD from Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark, 1966. We're delighted to have you as a reader here. Join me in welcoming our poet for the evening, Ron Talney.
This is overwhelming to see these many folks coming out on a rainy night like this. Thank you for being here. The man who wanted to write a poem. You want to write a poem. You have always wanted to write a poem. Even now, the blankness of paper offends you. Your hand moves over the white expanse. On your wrist, words begin to hum. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I certainly thank the series and the city of Milwaukie and the library system for the invitation to be here. I consider myself the dinosaur of local poetry. As I was getting ready for this evening, it occurred to me that I published my first poem 50 years ago. Wow. And that was a little frightening. And I actually remember the poem. It was horrible. But it appeared in some very obscure little poetry magazine that obviously didn't survive very long. And at least I convinced one editor that it was okay. Whenever I'm going to do a reading, I always have this recurring nightmare that no one will show up. And sometimes I don't even show up. So it's really lovely to see you all here. And it's nice for me to be back in the world of poetry. I've been hustling prose work for the last year or two, and it's nice to be back in poetry. I'm going to read mostly, at least at the outset, from the book that Tom mentioned, the New and Selected Poems, A Secret Weeping of Stones, because this is a book that draws from the 4 previous books that go back, as you might well imagine, for a number of years. And it kind of covers where I've been, I guess I would say. But I want to read a couple of poems that are not mine initially, because I think they lay a basis for my own view of what poems ought to be. One of them is a poem by a fairly obscure poet now by the name of Brewster Giesland. And I think Brewster Giesland taught in Utah somewhere. Maybe Bill knows, he's nodding his head here. It's a poem that Dick Hugo used as a teaching poem for many years, and I'm going to read that poem plus an early poem of Dick Hugo's, and then I'll start reading some of my poems, and I think you may see some connection there. This poem is entitled Rattlesnake, and it's a poem that if you look at it as closely as Dick suggested, I think it'll show you a lot about what poetry can accomplish. I found him sleepy in the heat and dust of a gopher burrow, coiled in loose folds upon silence in a pit of the noonday hillside. I saw the wedged bulge of the head hard as a fist. I remember his delicate ways, the mouth a cat's mouth yawning. I crushed him deep in dust and heard the loud seethe of life in the dead beads of the tail fade, as wind fades from the wild grain of the hill. And the poem I'll read of Dick Hugo's is an early poem of his. It's from his second book, The Death of the Powson Tavern. It's called In Stafford Country, and I think you'll see the bridge between Giesland's poem. No hills, raw wind unchecked brings word of death from Texas. No shade, sun bruises the oats gold. With homes exposed, no wonder people love. Farms absorb the quiet of the snow, and birds are black and nameless miles away. Without a shield of hills, a barricade of elms, one resorts to magic, hiding the joker well behind the gesturing hand. Childish wars continue in our minds. Paint is the gray it was in Carthage. Where land is flat, words are far apart. Each word is seen coming from far off, a calm storm, almost familiar across the plain. The word floats by, alive. Homes are empty, and the love goes on as the odor of grain jumps in the wind. We don't hear enough of Dick Hugo anymore. I wish we heard more of him. The poem I'm going to read, let's see, do I have something to drink around here? There we go. Got to keep the whistle wet. The first poem I want to read is called The Gardener. And this is an early poem of mine. And some years back, we lived next door to a fellow who was an avid gardener. And in those days, we might have called him mildly retarded. I guess those terms are no longer acceptable today. He might be viewed as mildly mentally challenged, whatever the appropriate term is. But he would be out in his garden at all hours, day and night, come spring. The gardener. Worried by death, my neighbor readjusts his yard each spring. Even at night we hear the click and rattle of his hoe, working through the crust so darkly, roots take hold. Not bright, but strong, he bends into the weight of earth, winter melting from his face, until at last the blood turns quick again, feeding his dim mind with dreams, and the final crack of tulip bulbs, discovering a vacancy to fill. The next poem is also an early poem. It's called Summer Grapes. This was written during the height of the Vietnam War, and it was my effort at an anti-war poem, although you probably wouldn't guess that if I didn't tell you. During that period of time, for those of you old enough to remember it, there was a ton of poetry written against the war. Many anthologies were produced. Most of the poetry wasn't very good. It was as poetry. It was great as propaganda, but not very good as poetry. And I think one of the reasons was that the poems tried to encompass such broad ideas. They did, and the best poems seemed to be the ones that honed in on some small specific acts of violence that represented what war can do. And I remember one in particular that was written by Sandra McPherson, who was a Portland poet at one time, now I think teaches at University of California, Davis. And it was about someone in the Safeway store picking out produce, and she managed to work in that tiny act of violence and expand it into this concept of war. So this is called Summer Grapes, and this is my approach to it. I remember William Carlos Williams wrote a book that he called Sour Grapes. And one critic got on him about it. Why would you name a book Sour Grapes? And he said, well, I just meant that sour grapes have the same shape as sweet ones. So, in any event, he was such a sweet man. Summer Grapes. Across the road, my neighbor sits propped on his sun deck, eating cold green seedless grapes. The quick selective hand, the slow delight, the obvious concern for shapes and methodology. Trapped like something wild in his teeth, the morning shatters bone, and slowly the heavy fruit of all we loved bends into sacrifice. This next poem is called Fears. When I was a kid, I used to go to the barbershop, of course, and in those days it wasn't called a salon or anything like that. You just went in, you didn't have an appointment, you just went in and waited. And eventually someone would say next, and you'd clamber up into the chair. And I had an experience with the barbershop where, being a kid, I always did what I was told. And it was a hot summer day, and I climbed into the barber chair, and the barber put the cloth around my neck so tightly that I sat there for about 5 minutes till I keeled over. And it never occurred to me to say anything. So I always have this certain dread of going to the barber shop. So, Fears. My barber hates me. I feel guilty eating meat. Night comes and I consume the soft perfection, moving the slow air more slowly. Darkness leaps in my eyes, strange as a handshake. A secret weeping of stones comes from each small crack my life has made in the earth. Somewhere a voice says, next. My thoughts break toward the funny light. This next poem is called An Elegy for an Oregon Town. I once asked Bill Stafford what the secret was to writing a Pacific Northwest poem, and with his characteristic twinkle, he said, well, you need to get a salmon in there somewhere. So we worked a salmon in there somewhere, called Elegy for an Oregon Town. Somehow small towns go hard. I used to dream you into stone, a hardness flashing like some violent river in my head. And you would rise like water churning white to rest your weight where human bodies break into 1,000 arrowheads of bone, or fishhooks riding salmon to the shore. But now you crack like any tired face, and I must reconstruct your birth from lakes too deep for drowning, from children dying down your mountainsides. You wrestle in my flesh with real events, and reaching into stone I harden with your weight. 1,000 arrowheads of bone, and fishhooks riding salmon in my throat.
Ron, is it possible that, am I the only one who's missing some of the words? 'Cause
You want
your
me to
voice
get
is
this down a little
very
bit?
soft.
Sure, great. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, is the mic on?
I think so, yes, yes. This is a poem that was written for my new son. My wife and I adopted a little boy when he was 20 months old, and he had been living as a foster child since his birth with an African American family. And I had some irrational fear that he would have difficulty adjusting to me in my not African American face. So I wrote a poem for him. We called him Aaron, A-A-R-O-N, who, as you all know, I'm sure, was the brother of Moses, right? We didn't name him that because of that. We wanted to give him a leg up, and we figured when he got to school, if they lined them up alphabetically, he'd always be at the head of the line. As it turned out, he was always at the head of the line anyway. So this is a poem for a new Aaron. It has an epigraph, and Aaron, from the book of Numbers, and Aaron shall be gathered to his people. Create me black, for I am your new father. When all the sky darkens into eyes, and all the night tightens its memory about the moon, I will be the face that made you. I will be your new bone, however white. And when you cry for flesh you never knew, and touch my strange familiar shape, then all these walls of skin must break across the fiction of our lives. Our dreams were right, our faces only lies. I better keep track of time here because I could go on forever, and I'm sure you can.
Please do. Yeah.
The next poem is called A Taste of Earth, and it was written for my daughters, one of whom is here tonight. It used to be a wonder to me as a young man to go into their bedroom. They shared a bedroom as children, and Jennifer was in the upper bunk, and Allison was in the lower bunk, and I would just stand and watch them breathing in their sleep. It seemed a miracle to me. So this is a poem written on my 31st birthday, so you can see it's not yesterday. It was my second summer, and the taste of earth was soft as dreaming children in their necessary sleep. But now it is my 31st, and daughters fill these rooms as if they are the anxious ground in which all future shapes lie, waiting for some final spark to flame the substance of their wondering. My darling seeds, I watch the heartening take, the tissue break into its colored growth, and fill your almost grown-up rooms with taproots thrusting deeper in the dark. Caught by the energy of your design, I work parental fingers in the ground and wait. My taste of earth, my tender throats of future sound. Well, I want to read a reunion poem, a class reunion poem. This is a poem that I wrote that would have been the reunion speech I would have given to my high school class if they'd asked me. Which they didn't. And there are some references here that perhaps I should at least warn you of. One is that I make reference to a sadistic nurse. I don't know if there's any nurses here. I don't mean to blaspheme you. This nurse gave us physicals each fall for those boys that wanted to go out for sports. And we would line up in the gymnasium in our underwear, and the coach would put up butcher paper over the windows so the girls couldn't peek in at us. And we would line up in this cold gymnasium. At one end there was a small office, which was the coach's office, and this nurse would be in there on the coach's swivel desk chair, and a boy would step in, he would drop his drawers, and she would check him for hernias. So you would hear this going on to the, and being young boys of teenage years, sometimes they would show some measure of arousal, which apparently disturbed her quite a bit. And she would have a tongue depressor between her teeth. And if she saw any movement whatsoever, she would take the tongue depressor, whack the offending member. So as you're standing back in the line, you would hear this cacophony of whack, it was great to anticipate. But I'm sure most of you remember your high school days with perhaps as little fondness as I do. This is called a reunion speech for the class of '54. My friends, no school should be this bleak. These rooms are still that lonely gray, walls still shabby in their disrepair, and windows dark from years of hiding our defeat. Tonight those voices droning, dry as chalk, I think of locker rooms and sweat, the cruel coach making men from boys, of that sadistic nurse who gave us physicals each fall. I see old Mrs. Peck, who liked me, weeping her frustration at the jokes, and Mr. Blake, who didn't, standing dazed, his one suit ruined when the ink bomb struck. I think of fire drills, that black hole opening out to daylight swirling, and the teacher's sudden slap, the long run home, and shame the years can't ever take away. Dear friends, we earned those years like pain. What hurts is what we can't let go. Even now, I dream my ancient need for girls in nylons, moving in their sweet, slow dance. Our awkward arms embrace. Our names are shouting failure at the sky. The next poem I'll read is called Ecola. Ecola is that area down at the coast where on Tillamook, which is visible from the Cannon Beach side. And Ecola is the Chinook word for whale. And the legend is that during the time of Lewis and Clark, a whale beached out there, and the native people went out and harvested the blubber and the oil, hence the name Ecola. Some years ago, Dick Hugo was teaching a workshop at Haystack, sponsored by Portland State, no longer apparently in existence. And he had just gotten married for a second time and had acquired a sudden family, 2 stepchildren as well as his wife Ripley. And he had rented a little house on Tillamook Head looking out at Ecola. And Ripley and the children were coming out from Montana and were not going to be there for a few days. So he called me lonely, and he said, "Talney, come down." That's what he never called me wrong. It was always, "Talney, come down. I'm lonely." So I went down, and we spent a few days there, and it was interesting because he would be sitting on one side of the living room looking out at the scene, and he was writing a poem for his new stepdaughter, Melissa, and the two of them were having a little bit of conflict getting used to one another. And so I was on the other side of the room writing a poem and looking out at the scene of Ecola. And every now and then he'd say, "Talney, listen to this." And he'd recite some line, and I'd say, "Hey, that's great, Dick, great." And then a while later I'd say, "Hey, look at this." So we had this antiphony going back and forth. So this is the poem that I wrote at that time. The ocean draws us, desperate to these rocks. That man who speaks our name says love is here. We are the seascape moving in his eyes, the bitter grays receding like abandoned homes. This place is where our voids begin, where children breathing water die and learn their way among the bones of ships, the cruelty of distance on their fins. Don't think we ever love enough. That man who speaks our name is really wind. We walk this shore of sad remains alone, our silly bodies alien in these tides. Ecola booming, love me to the sea. Time for more wedding blues. I'm doing time like that. I never knew my paternal grandparents. Both of them were deceased by the time I was born. My father was born in Russia, in the city of Odessa on the Black Sea. My grandfather was an extremely well-educated man, spoke 14 languages fluently. He was the Minister for Jewish Affairs in the cabinet of Tsar Nicholas II. And in 1905, there were uprisings throughout Russia as a result of the Tsar having signed what they called the October Manifesto, which expanded the rights of common people, including the Jewish population. And there was a lot of backlash to that, and there were pogroms going on throughout the Jewish communities as particularly Cossacks would ravage through the Jewish communities, killing, burning property, and so forth. My father's sister, Vera, who was 5 years of age at that time, was playing in the courtyard of the family home when a pogrom ignited. And one of my father's earliest memories was of his father bringing her body into the house after the Cossacks had moved on to other places. My grandfather was given 24 hours to leave the country, which he did, wound up in New York City, Ellis Island. A year and a half later, he was able to send for the rest of the family, which at that time was my grandmother, Sophie, and my father and his 3 remaining siblings. And they arrived at Ellis Island on May 31st, 1907. So I never knew my grandfather, never knew my grandmother. So I wrote a poem for my grandfather back some time ago, which I'll read now. And just recently I wrote one for my grandmother, which I'll read as well. This is called The Lost Grandfather. Now, as I understand it in the Jewish world, the concept of sin is not so much doing something bad or evil, but rather it is falling short, as an arrow might fall short of its target. Because we're human, we fall short. So that is the context in which the term is used in this poem. Grandfather, after all these years, I'm searching for you. Searching through the cities where you lived. Winnipeg, Philadelphia, New York, Odessa. Uncertain even of your name. Grandfather, my lips now move along the walls that hold you. I tear them down stone by stone, looking for your eyes, your bones that are my bones, your face turning dark in my hands. Grandfather, my old rabbi, did you ever hold me? Did you take me into your ritual? Did you cut me with your holy knife? And did my small blood bloom on your tongue? Grandfather, did you teach me those magic words that now somehow I know? Today my father takes his grandson for a walk. I see them hand in hand, striding toward the park, their voices holding in the winter air. O my wandering Jew, my ark, I watch them deepen with your touch. Teacher, man of God, I am your flesh, you are my bone. See if I can find my new poem for Sophie. Yeah, right here. A couple of years ago, my wife and I went to Winnipeg, where my grandparents are buried, where they lived out their adult years. And we went to the Jewish cemetery where both of them are buried. My grandmother was not accustomed to poverty. They lived very well in the old country until political circumstances changed for them. But they arrived in New York with nothing. The vessel containing all of their goods sank at sea, so they simply had what they brought with them on the SS Moskva, which was basically their clothing. They were at sea for about 6 weeks in steerage, which was the lowest possible passage. People became ill, people died, people were hungry. But my grandmother had an emerald necklace sewn into the seam of her dress that had been a gift to her from the Tsarina. That necklace is still in the family. My cousin Ada in Winnipeg has it. So there's a reference to it in this. This is at the Jewish cemetery in Winnipeg, Manitoba, for Sophie.
Ron,
Yes.
I'm still losing the volume of your voice, especially toward the end of each sentence.
Yeah, I'll try to do better,
I
Richard.
want to hear all the words.
Well, I may not want you to hear all the words. You gonna work on that for me?
Yeah.
Oh, bless you. Okay. So we do it? At the Jewish cemetery in Winnipeg, Manitoba, for Sophie. Grandmother, we are meeting here for the first time. You, deep beneath your stone, the carved marble, the Star of David, small white pebbles scattered about your grave. Papa rests beside you, both now silent to the passages of time. At last I know you, know our history, know the pogroms, the death of children, your weeks in steerage, years in poverty and want, still observant to the ancient ways, the Tsarina's jewels, still hidden safe inside your gown. I see you standing on the deck, the SS Moskva, grandfather there waiting, the new world waiting, the future waiting in your eyes. How could you have known? How could it be we never learned the language necessary to preserve our past? Grandmother, here I stand. I hear the silence of your time on earth, words left unspoken in the broken light of years. I'm going to read a poem called The Children of Masada. Some years ago, I did a lot of criminal defense work. And some years ago, I was representing a woman charged with the murder of her child. At the time, the Oregonian called it the worst case of child abuse in the state's history. I worked on that case entirely for about 8 months, preparing it for trial and so forth. I had a child about the same age at that time, and it was a traumatic experience for me as well as everyone else involved. And for about 1.5 years after that case, I was unable to write. I tried writing poems from time to time. And it's hard to write poems when you don't think they could possibly have any value compared with the death of that child. And one day I was walking through the lobby of my office, and I saw the new National Geographic there, and I opened it up. And there was a broad panoramic view of Masada, the former temple of King Herod in the Judean desert by the Dead Sea. And I read the account of what had happened at Masada when the Jewish zealots were sieged there by the Romans. About 900 men, women, and children were under siege, Jewish zealots who had tried to overthrow the Romans in Judea. And when it became apparent after a number of months that the siege was going to be successful and the Romans were going to breach the fortress, the fathers decided that they would each kill their own families, and then they would draw lots to determine the order in which they would be killed. And when the Romans entered the fortress, they found 900 and some dead men, women, and children. And I went to my office and I sat down and wrote this poem. This is where the children died. The fortress of Masada stands witness to their deaths. Each father killed his own, and then drew lots until the perfect silence was obtained. Roman soldiers won the solitude, but took no slaves. They call me esoteric, but these deaths go on and on. Today, a child still crawls these cliffs and beats his life out on the rocks below. I paint his twisted face into a grin, a photographic pose my camera can't endure, and watch bright flowers bursting from his chest. What place could live by such a code of stones and dust? Someday I'll dig in these remains and find what children cry when parents come with knives and hands to love them from the rock. No blood could really live this long, and yet I hear the soldiers march, their armor clanking closer in the desert air. Father, Father, love me with your spade, your club, your esoteric hands, and I will burst into the only victory we are. I'll read the poem that was, that is the broadside that you were given today. It's called The Broken World. And it has an epigraph from Hart Crane. And so it was I entered the broken world to trace the visionary company of love. I had a friend whose marriage had fallen apart, and she had gone to the coast to lick her wounds. I see you there at the edge of land, the deep, sad arc of your face dying against the seawall. In the distance, the buoy's distant moans roll in minute by minute, and at your back, weather growing cruel. I first met Dick Hugo at a conference at the University of Washington at a resort area called Lake Wilderness. Jim Fleming, who's here tonight, he and I went up together. It was not a writers' conference, it was a conference into an inquiry into the creative process through writing poetry. And the faculty consisted of Dick Hugo, Madeline DeFries, who was still at that time Sister Madeline DeFries, and Warren Carrier, who was the head of the writing department at the University of Montana at the time. And the program was that each of the faculty would give a craft lecture, and then at some point during the weekend would give a poetry reading. Dick, his first marriage had just ended, and he was on his way to Italy. He was drinking a lot, And after his reading, Jim and I and several others went with him to a place called the Lake Wilderness Tavern. And we happened to close up the place. And Dick had just published a book, as I read a poem from it earlier, The Death of the Kapowsin Tavern. Kapowsin being a small town in northern Washington, and the Kapowsin Tavern had apparently recently burned down, which in Dick's world was truly a tragedy. So we got out of the Lake Wilderness Tavern, and Dick insisted, since Kapowsin wasn't that far away, that we should see the remains of the Kapowsin Tavern. So we all piled into his Buick convertible, and off we went, which we shouldn't have done, but we did. And I remember about 2:30 at night or in the morning, cruising through the deserted streets of Kapowsin. This is the Lake Wilderness Tavern, dedicated to Jim Fleming, my good friend and poet. The sun still rises and our faces reassemble to the dawn. Doors of eyes reopen and life goes back to glory, and the weight of birds hung over in the wilderness last night. A huge bear, Hugo, sang his melody from flower beds that mourn, while lady skunks broke tangible as glass, and even Gable Clark brought voice to bear, God damn it, live, on pansies growing final in the dark. The matchbooks in our pockets and the empty case of beer say what we've been when road maps turn to sound, for we become whatever poems make real, and only words for human work this ground. I'm going to read a couple of poems that I have never read in public before, and will probably never read again. Well, for reasons that you'll see are apparent. Let me find. We need to change the. I've got so much stuff in it. There we go. The most famous poem in the English language, I'm told, is the Purple Cow poem. Really. Everybody knows it. Not everybody knows who wrote it.
Gillette Bridges?
Yes, Gillette Bridges. Gillette Burgess, actually. Burgess was, I think, an engineer by profession, and did a number of other things and had a number of other writings which should have had some notoriety, but this little poem simply took over. So I decided I'd write some parodies to it of what famous poets might have written if they had written the Purple Cow poem. So this is Purple Cow variations on a theme. I've never seen a purple cow. I hope to never see one. But I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. Okay, here's number one. This is variation number one. Sunset and evening's glow, and one clear call to me. May there be no mooing of the cow when I put out to sea. But such a cow as mooing seems asleep, too full of sound and foam, when that which drew from out the purple deep turns home again. This is number two. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, purple cow thou ever wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou spinnest, like a cloud of fire, the purple deep that wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest, This cow, as we've never seen before, and seen still will never want for more. 3. If I can stop one purple cow from mooing, I shall not have lived in vain. If I can ease one purple cow its wooing and cool its pain, or help that cow to know its true design, I shall not have lived in vain. You know why Emily Dickinson's chicken ran across the road?
Why?
It would not stop for death. Oh. Whose woods these are, I think I know. Somehow, they must belong to a purple cow. A purple cow with head so low, and she is in the manger so. Her tongue is black, her sides they gleam. A purple cow, yes, it would seem. 5. So much depends upon a purple cow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chicken. 6. A cow of purple is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. I have never seen this phenomenon, yet ever keep a brave lookout, lest I should be asleep when she comes by. For though I would not be one, I've oft imagined 'twould be a joy to see one. 7. In Flanders fields the poppies grow, beneath the crosses row on row. And there beneath that distant tree, a purple cow I think I see. There in concert with the dead, she chews her cud and nods her head. War's din is past, the silence true, the living cast in garish hue. And here's the final one. I'll let you off the hook at this point. I thought that I would never see a cow as lovely as a tree. A tree whose hungry mouth was pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast. And then before my eyes at last, a purple cow with horns was cast. A purple cow with hide so sweet, a purple tenderloin of meat. Poems are made by fools somehow, but only God can make a cow. That's the one and only time that will be read in public. Oh, aren't we poets madcap, though? How are we doing time-wise? Well, we got a few minutes, I guess. Okay. This is my Beating the Big C poem. You all know what the big C is. Okay. I wouldn't mind it so much if I still had my prostate. But here I am, sitting in the exam room, waiting for my doc. The one with the oversized middle finger. And the Hollywood right out of Central casting good looks. It's not fair. I'm guessing he still has his prostate too. He comes in and greets me, smiling his best George Clooney smile, snapping on his latex glove. The rest is history. 10 years, he suddenly exclaims, looking down at my chart. Cured, he adds, saying those words for the very first time in all these years. All those visits, the blood tests, the hospital, the surgery, all those months and days anxiously awaiting test results. And now, 10 years, he says, cured, congratulations. This time he beams his Brad Pitt special. I pull up my pants, fasten my belt, shake his giant hand, and leave the room. Cured. Suddenly it's like a day at the beach. I'm a new man. Driving home, I glance into the rearview mirror. Practice my killer smile. Yes, it's the new me, Tom Cruise, right out of Central Cast. As Tom said, I just came back from Hawaii. And while I'm in Hawaii, I usually try to write a prose poem every day. And I think it's because I'm too lazy to write a real poem. And I've been writing a lot of prose the last couple of years, so this kind of fits in. And it makes me think like I'm still writing, so that's what I do. And I'm going to read a couple of them. They're quite brief. The prose poem has been said to be an impossibility, actually. It's either one or the other, but in fact, there's a long, rich history of prose poems. Poems that look like prose, but act like poems. Somebody once said that the prose poem is the literary equivalent of the veggie burger. So this is Kona. We ate lunch today on the veranda of the Royal Kona. The deep blue of the Pacific keeping us company. The zebra doves cooing in the background. Iced tea and grilled ahi sandwiches with Hawaiian sweet potato fries. They were delicious. We were surrounded by elderly women towing a few elderly men in their wake. Part of a tour group, all sporting badges of identification and tote bags with the company logo. It's not like this in Omaha, said one woman, biting into her mahi-mahi sandwich with aioli sauce dripping down her chin. Another lady, perhaps her widowed sister, seemed to agree. It's not like this in Omaha. An old man turned his face to the sea, stared off into the distance, and nodded. This one's President's Day in Hobbytown. Hobbytown is a little town on the edge of the Big Island, kind of the end of the road. It was President's Day, and there we were. It's February 20th, President's Day, late in the morning. We are sitting in front of Mother's Cigar Store in Harvey, drinking decaf Americanos. The town seems to us to be at the far reaches of the world. Everyone here looks like they must have an arrest warrant out somewhere on the mainland. 3 old-timers, local guys, are sitting at the table next to us drinking coffee and chatting. They look like they've been sitting there forever. Is George Bush still the president, asks one. No, it's some Hawaiian kid, says the middle guy. No shit, says the third guy. No shit. They look over at us, give us the hang loose sign, and in a single gesture, we all raise our cups and laugh. Okay. All right, I'll close with one much more serious poem. This is a poem that relates really to the losses of children throughout the history of our family, beginning with Vera. My sister lost a child. My wife and I have lost a child. So this is called In the Stillness of Names, a Family Portrait. It is 1905, Odessa, Russia, the courtyard of our home. The Cossack soldiers march, they shout, they sing. The child is dead. Her body blooms with machine gun fire. Her father takes her into his arms. They disappear. It is 1943, La Grande, Oregon, the new world. We are together again. My sister holds me. She dresses me in baby clothes. She pushes me down 8th Street in the pram, the only one in town. On Adams Avenue, the soldiers march, they shout, they sing. It is 1943. There is no meat, no sugar. Through the trees, the flat white face of the moon rises. In the hills above the town, wolves lie quiet in the snow. In front of Bonenkamp's, the old men sit. They watch the hills, waiting for some sign. It is 1960. Another child is dead. The long snake of his birth is ended. Deformed, he takes on perfection like air, like stone. It is 1988. Beside a turnpike in New Jersey, a child lies broken in the rain. In the midst of wreckage, she stirs from her cage of bones and skin. Her mouth puckers with a new freedom. It is 1905, Odessa, Russia, the courtyard of our home. Again the soldiers march, they shout, they sing. Our Father takes us into his arms. In the stillness of names we lie down. And slowly, slowly, all these wounds we've shared reopen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I understand there's time left for questions, observations, accusations, anything that anybody might want to comment on or whatever. Yes.
One thing, Ron, what's your writing practice?
It depends what I'm doing. As I mentioned, recently I've been promoting a new novel, a rather raunchy satiric thriller called Knockers Up, copies of which are on the back. And so I've been reading from that, and while I was working on that, and also a memoir called The Archives of Silence, a father's memoir, my practice was pretty much a daily writing process. I'm an early bird. I get up early, my wife sleeps in, so I have time to work in the morning. And I'm retired now, so I have my time to do it. When I'm writing poetry, it's more catch as catch can, and that was something that was compatible with my working life. I remember William Carlos Williams talking about, who was a pediatrician all of his professional life, talking about how when the patient was with him, he was 100% with the patient, and the minute the patient was out the room, the typewriter came out and he was writing his poems. I've kind of felt that I operated on a parallel course in much the same way. But as I say, it's catch as catch can. Yeah. Diane, you had a question or something?
Yes, I was just wondering if that you let your purple cow in your mountain park home, or if you need to chain it outside because there's.
Well, we have CCNRs that cover precisely the issue of purple cows in Lake Oswego, and they're not allowed. If they were blonde, it would be okay. But purple cows are not permitted in Lake Oswego, so we have to keep them indoors. Yeah. Any other?
I think your poems about your grandparents were very touching.
Thank you. I wish I had known them.
Yes.
My father was very secretive about his family history. My mother was born in Scotland, and she let it all out. She had all kinds of stories told in her Scottish brogue. But my father was very, very secretive. I'm not sure entirely why. I think there may have been a good deal of humiliation in the immigration process for him to be an 8-year-old child arriving in this country with no knowledge of English. And if you had heard him speak as an adult, you would not have detected any accent of any kind. He worked terribly hard. And of course, he changed the family name. Our family name was Spitalnikov. And Spitalnikov. And when my grandfather arrived in this country, he cut the sp off the front. And when my father, we immigrated to the United States from Canada, he cut the cough off the back end. So it was like the dog that got his ears cropped and his tail cut off. So he anglicized the name, and he did everything he could to and I think also part of it may have been that his background was Jewish, and he was had converted and become a Presbyterian minister. So he may have wished to leave his history behind him. I don't know, but I'm speculating.
Do
Yes.
you really know which boat it was that brought them over, the date of it?
Yes, I do. The Ellis Island records are very complete, and I have a copy of the manifest from the ship that they came in on. And the only variation is that they list my father as being 5 years of age, when in fact he was 8. And I think probably being quite small for his age, they got a cheaper fare by saying he was 5. But yes, the records are very thorough. I have not been able to find exact records for my grandfather, but that's fine. Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak Russian?
Pardon?
Can you speak Russian?
Я не говорю по-русски очень хорошо. No, I don't speak Russian very well. I wish I did. I studied Russian I went to the only high school in the United States during the Cold War that taught Russian. And I took a couple of years of Russian there and a couple of years of Russian at Lewis and Clark College. But that's many years ago, and I have not had any particular use or need for the language. So.
Not even in your poetry writing?
Pardon?
Not even in your writings?
No, not really. I suppose some translation work might be appropriate, but I think my family's disaffection from Russia is such that I don't feel particularly drawn to Russian. And I remember when I was studying Russian in high school, my father was quite upset. He did not want me learning the language.